Hello and a very warm welcome to Insight. I'm Amandra Bhatt. Today we talk about US Vice President Joe Biden's recently concluded visit to India. And to discuss the outcome of Joe Biden's visit to India, we are joined in our studios by three distinguished guests. Please welcome Mr. Lalit Mansingh, a former Foreign Secretary, also a former Indian Ambassador to the US. Welcome to Insight, Mr. Mansingh. Sitting next to him is Dr. Sreeram Chaulia, a Professor and Dean with Jindal School of International Affairs. Welcome to Insight, Professor Chaulia. And we are also joined by Sandeep Dixit, Senior Journalist, Special Correspondent with The Hindu. Welcome to Insight, Mr. Dixit. Professor Chaulia, how do you look at the Vice President's visit?
Yeah, Biden indisputably, is like he's been set up within the Obama administration to come up with contrary viewpoints and alternatives. So I'm sure he's brought that gravitas to India, and he's thinking about how to reorient the big picture being our role in the Asia Pacific especially. And I noted, especially in one of his speeches here, he was saying there's no contradiction between being a strategic partner and having strategic autonomy. So clearly, he has come with big picture in mind, and that's always good because, we anyway do the integrity pretty well, and we have been trying to overcome some of these hitches that Ambassador Mansingh just mentioned. But then the big picture is always good. So I think he brought that to the table, and that was clearly discussed, and that shows that now, this relationship, for it to take off, the economic side is one, then there's the geostrategic one. And I think both seem to have been amply covered. So in that sense, you can definitely call it a landmark trip that will be remembered.
Okay. Professor Chaulia, the relationship is not stuck anywhere, but at the same time, it has lost its momentum somewhat. We do not seem to be going anywhere in a lot of areas. For instance, in the question of FDI, of course, just ahead of the visit, the government raised FDI caps in some sectors. But then there is also the question of the civil nuclear agreement, where the US feels India has not delivered its end of the bargain.
Yeah, I'm reminded of Calvin Coolidge, one of the American presidents in the 1920s, who said, the business of the American people is business, right? So they're obviously, commercial motives have always been very, very prominent. And in the last, 22 years since we have liberalized the economy, India is seen as a, potential for American businesses to sell and invest in a big way. So then there's some disappointment with that. And we have our own domestic problems vis-a-vis attracting foreign investment, which has been drying up. So, so there is some degree of, one can call it, this was like the enchanted land, one of those big, like people at Harvard were all writing things about how this is going to be, the next 1 billion market and all that. But then the point is, in terms of concrete returns, there is, concern on the American side. That's why Biden was talking about protectionism and how trade needs to be open. And if you have set an ambitious target of, say, quintupling the bilateral trade from 100 to 500 billion,
right,
I think a lot of barriers will need to be overcome. So it's natural. I mean, commercial diplomacy always faces bargains and tough bargaining because it affects always, when you liberalize trade or investment regime, it creates winners and losers on both sides. And to pacify the losers and to bring them on board, it's a ongoing process.
Okay. Professor Chaulia, removing the bottlenecks that exist in our system that bedevil trade ties between India and the US, do you think we have been able to address some of them at least?
More on investment. If you see the bilateral investments, like less than 30 billion, and that's somewhere we need to push harder. And there is a BIT, Bilateral Investment Treaty, which is being discussed. And I think that
It's a BIPA, Bilateral Investment Protection Agreement.
Yeah.
It's not discussed yet, but it's on the table.
In the pipeline. So we need, traction on that front, because we do need foreign investment, and we need to reverse the, in fact, we have become net, exporters of foreign investment in the last few years, and which is a good thing in the sense that Indian companies are taking, charge of businesses overseas. But on the converse side, the inflow has really, really become a trickle.
Right.
So we need to reverse that. And America is still one of the largest sources of FDI in the world, and therefore, just in volumes. So therefore, we need to attract. I think finance sector, insurance, these are probably areas where they see a lot of potential. Although again, we will be careful because the kind of deregulatory mess that they created in Wall Street. We don't want to import all that, right? So they will have to deal with a state that's much more vigilant that we have, and which is more in control of the banking sector. So even when big titans from US finance want to come in and invest, they will need to bear in mind. It's the same with the Chinese. I mean, the Chinese keep saying this. If you do a bilateral investment treaty with us, I mean, you have to abide by our local laws and regulations.
Right.
So these are some sticking points. The other one is the local content regulations. That's been something the Americans want to be removed because they say, buy Indian or so-called buy Indian clauses into all these mean that it reduces the margins and the profitability, and so these are the kind of thing. But then at the end of the day, we will have our own interests to protect in terms of local substitutes that should not be completely swamped, right? So you can call it protectionism or whatever, but at the nascent stage, maybe the excuse is that they're still nascent, but at some point we'll be able to compete with them. But until then, certain sectors will need to be given preference against these giants. So that will stay.
The question of FDI and also the question of civil nuclear liability deal. It seems that we are able to get through these agreements, but not able to take them off the ground. Professor Chaulia?
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is part of the give and take. There's considerable promise that we have held out as a large market, and they will always measure us by whether we are yielding that. But this one, the other issue is about we being able to also increase our exports to the other side, and our output FDI being also given preference as some kind of equal to. So there are lots of these things where everything is reciprocal, right? So we'll have to really come up with some kind of understanding where the mutual interests are obviously being raised, but there is also a degree of acceptance that it cannot be 100%. That's always it's always suboptimal, but ideally it should be optimal. But then when the outcome is suboptimal, we need a degree of understanding. I think in the long run, as this relationship progresses, these will look back as for example, people say the immigration bill in the US. It does have restrictions that affect our IT companies with this whole visa system, work visa, and all those things. But then, in the long run, they probably won't matter that much because the overall picture is going in the positive direction.
Professor Chaulia, what can we expect on the Afghanistan front? Because from the looks of it, the Taliban are going to have their way eventually. In such a scenario, what role can India play or can be permitted to play? That assumes importance to us.
I think the United States, because battlefield realities force them to be tactical, as in focused on the withdrawal, on getting the Pakistanis on board, and trying to reach some kind of reconciliation or power sharing agreement in Kabul and all these issues. But if they take a strategic view, and that's why we need more longer term thinking about 2020, 2030. India is going to be far more important in the larger scheme of things for American interests in this region. Think about it. We have an America which is, Biden claims that we can be anywhere all the time. But the reality is that they cannot project power all over the place anymore. I've been saying that it's no longer a global hegemon, but a multi-regional hegemon only. So for that role to be progressing, they will need to find partners who are sharing some of the security burdens in specific sub-regions of the world. In Asia, clearly, it's not an exaggeration when they say that India is the most important partner in Asia. Partner isn't different from ally. We can never be an ally because we have our own the autonomy and the non-alignment and all those things. So we can never be like Japan, which has American bases. I think it will never be acceptable to the people of India. But on the other hand, we are the most important partner in Asia. So what that means is that I think the Afghan, as the war winds down, and Obama, as and Biden, by the way, have been pressing for ending this war much sooner than what the Pentagon would want, and some of the more conservative right-wing hawks in the U.S. administration, in the government and the Congress want. So I think they will. It's obvious, it's inevitable that India is going to be far more central. So I think the only fear I have had in the last 10 years has been the enormous amount of military aid that the Americans have pumped into Pakistan. That it's like some $17 billion, something like that. At least on paper. So, that has altered the balance somewhat and has created all kinds of, I would say, uppity behavior on the parts of the Pakistanis. But I think as we move forward and as the Americans get more strategic, I think India is the go-to country in this region in order to maintain stability.
Professor Chaulia, how important is China a factor in India-US relations?
Well, there are so many triangles. There's Pakistan, India, US, and there's of course China, India, US, and there's probably China, Pakistan, US as well. But I think Obama administration, if you see, it's been an evolution vis-a-vis China. It started off, with talk about G2 and all that. Of course, from one of the advisors, not directly from the administration, but over time, the disputes and the dust-ups they've had over trade, protectionism, especially. There are so many dumping cases there at the WTO that the Americans are now taking against China and vice versa. And the aggression that the Chinese have been showing of late in Southeast and East Asia, Northeast Asia. That has really, I think, tempered some of the early optimism of the Obama administration. But nonetheless, there's no question that the notion of India as a counterbalance to China, which was very obvious and explicitly done during the Bush era, is not quite there now. And like, for example, Brahmacharya was saying that since that time, since Obama has come in, there's just no real big geostrategic cement that glues India and the United States together, by which he means that, they're no longer acting in concert to counterbalance China. But the point is, I think what the Americans are also realizing, and we also do, is that each of us, United States and India, has an independent relationship with China that is in itself has its own dynamics. I mean, Chinese investment trade with the United States is phenomenal. Okay. It's like 10 times or more than what we have. Right. And now our trade with China is also burgeoning. And even if you notice when we had the recent Daulat Beg Goldie episodes and all that, the Americans were mostly silent. They hardly they didn't really try and take a stance saying that the Chinese should withdraw or anything like that. So, and past experience shows us that we cannot always rely on the United States when it comes to our own territorial integrity and threats from across the border. But the fact that we have some degree of adversarial ties with the Chinese, especially on the security side, less on the economic side, means that we will always, willingly, probably unintentionally, be beneficial to the United States, which wants to be able to balance in the Indo-Pacific theater against the Chinese.
Okay, but Professor Chaulia, isn't this something that is going to hurt American businesses also in the long run? Yeah.
So, for example, on immigration, some of the titans of U.S. industry have been asking for more liberal regimes rather than more restrictive ones. But it's a tightrope the Obama administration is walking, because on one hand they want it to be opened up, but on the other hand, there are the conservatives who are saying we need to increase border security with Mexico and prevent more illegal entry into the country and all that. And the key context, which Sandeep had earlier raised, which is the ongoing economic depression. I mean, you have 1.8% growth, and it's being already touted as a recovery. There are many people who don't believe that there's really any long-term recovery for the United States until they really fix the banks, which they have not done, despite the Dodd-Frank regulation and all that. So I think America, is going to remain less open relatively than during the boom years before 2008, when everything came crashing down. And even with our growth, which has been decelerating, I think, you're going to have this, it's a twin quandary on both sides, where neither of us is really, on the upswing right now. And it doesn't look likely that we are going to emerge back to the, super healthy growth rates of the previous decade. So what it means is, it's going to be a slog. And there will be issues on their side where they're going to say, our local jobs need to be protected. I also, have a suspicion that this whole offshore model that our IT companies have been doing is being curtailed upon the pressure of some American competitors within Silicon Valley, who are feeling the heat because we are far more efficient and cost effective and all that, our companies. So there is a degree of that, protectionism, which is less to do with the overall immigration picture and more about, margins and how to compete against these, upstart Indian companies that are doing so well. So these are all, factors that will come in. And Obama has to listen, the Congress will be listening to all these interests. So if you look at the next 5 years, this economic crisis is not going to be over anytime soon.
Okay.
And so what we mean is, there will be some degree of suboptimal outcomes, as I said before.
Okay, so this has to be looked at in the backdrop of the current economic climate.
Climate change, green energy, Obama is pushing for it.
Right.
And it will be good if, for example, the Chinese are trying to completely crowd out the American competitors in solar and wind. So if some of them relocate and we can provide manufacturing base, that can also attract some FDI into the country, and it's for a good cause, which is to preserve the environment.
Like your final comments, starting with you, Professor Chaulia, what can we expect in days to come? Do you think we'd be able to overcome this perceived drift in relations?
Yeah, as I said before, if we take the long view and the strategic perspective, India-America, it's a bond that's not going to go away. It's not going to. It's not subject to the vagaries of the smaller tactical, discomforts that we keep facing from time to time. And I think we need to also have a dialogue about where we want to see India in the Middle East, because our energy dependence is increasing on that side. So while the Americans are only talking about India's role in the Asia Pacific, which is further to our east, we also have to talk about how we can be more, involved in the decision making that leads to some kind of settlements in all those
for
burning
the rest
spots.
of Afghanistan.
So I think all these places, Americans, apart from UN Security Council, we have the G20, but there are some other forums which are more regional in Africa, in the Middle East, in Latin America. That's where we need to push. Eventually, that's how it becomes a global partnership from just being a tactical relationship as